Well, hello, Christopher.
Howdy do, Ron. What's going on this evening?
Well, it's a Monday, so that must mean Monday night.
It is
Myths,
indeed
monsters, and mayhem.
myths, monsters, mysteries, mayhem, marshmallows, and everything in between.
That's right.
So,
And I would think
literally,
the
I
Tonight
just
Show.
was just with a Cub Scout group a couple of nights ago. We were doing s'mores, so marshmallows and all the good stuff. So,
Nice. And tonight's show, I would say, falls under the banner of legends. Would you say that?
absolutely, very much. It's kind of funny. When we started this channel, a little over a year ago, we were Monday Night Monsters specifically. We were sticking with pretty, dark and creepy legends, but it's been fun, I think, branching out into doing more of the mysteries and the myths and things like that. That's what led us to tonight's show, which I believe it was actually your suggestion. Because last week or not last week, but 2 weeks ago on our last show, we of course did Risen Gods, the sort of tradition of these, dead, dying and reborn sort of sacrificial gods. And one of the ones that we threw in there as a kind of a fun spin on the topic was the God King idea of Arthur, the once and future king. And I think you were very right that it was a topic worth exploring a little bit more in depth, and that's going to be a big part of what we do tonight.
Sure. Even here in America, although that's not part of our culture, the idea is so fixed within our humanity that becomes an archetype, right? What we're looking at is the idea of legend building and the idea of the hero. And I think that's really one of those facets within this genre of legends that I'm really fascinated in, because it does really connect us all together.
It does, and your original suggestion, of course, was that we sort of dive into the legend, which is very sort of deep and sort of complex legend of King Arthur. And while I was pulling together, excuse me, some of the information for the show, I thought, that there are basically two sides of the coin, because the legend of King Arthur, which most people have at least a basic understanding of, is a wonderful legend, and it's one that of course, it comes from a sort of pre-England, Britain and the Roman times. But there's another English legend that is very much like a flip side of the coin, and that would be the legend of Robin Hood, who is another one of these sort of heroic, risen from humble beginnings, sort of sacrificial hero figures. And so I thought that they were nice complements to one another. So that's, of course, our topic of the evening is the sword and the bow, basically the legends of King Arthur and Robin Hood, how they tie together, where they differ, and how it is, in fact, that these legends came to exist. And so again, I think it's wonderful that we're exploring more of these world legends as we sort of spread our wings a bit.
Absolutely. As we go through the night, we'll put on these lenses and filter all these kind of legends through the Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung schools of thought.
Very much. In fact, it is very the traditional hero's journey, almost precisely. It's interesting. I do think that I feel like everyone in some basic form knows the story of King Arthur. King Arthur, of course, most of us have the basics. He's a heroic king of England. He's got his lovely Queen Guinevere, wise sorcerer Merlin, his court of noble knights, and everything else. And that's the sort of the bubblegum version of the King Arthur legend. But what's I think interesting about Arthurian legend is that we tend to think of it in terms of, ho ho in my shining armor and marching into battle and victorious. And it's a very sort of, it is very almost campy, especially with like shows like Camelot and things like that, a very campy and very bright and shiny legend. But there is a strong darkness in the story of King Arthur. In fact, King Arthur, like so many great heroes of old, begins in tragedy. The story of King Arthur begins with his father, at least the sort of immediate story begins with his father, Uther Pendragon, in the most common legend. And Uther, becomes obsessed with the wife of one of his enemies, Igraine, this beautiful woman who's the wife of one of his enemies, and demands that Merlin change him into the shape of the Duke of Cornwall so that he can go and lie with Igraine for one night. And he promises, sort of effectively promises, everything he has to Merlin in exchange for what is effectively a rape. Goes and he lays with Igraine, ends up killing the Duke of Cornwall in battle, but a child is born of the union, and that child Merlin takes and raises, and that child ends up becoming the eventual King Arthur. And the story doesn't stop being dark there. You have his half sister Morgana, who's the daughter of Igraine, who ends up seducing Arthur, produces a child called Mordred, so yet another incestuous union. You have the eventual Mordred becomes Arthur's archenemy, and the king's failure, the queen's betrayal, all these different very, very dark things happen within this King Arthur legend that we tend to think of as such a bright and happy legend. So I feel like people rarely recognize the immense amount of tragedy and sort of darkness that belongs to the Arthur story.
Yeah, absolutely great point. So whenever we imagine the setting of King Arthur, we think of these great castles, and we think of, like you said, the knights in shining armor, when indeed the root of this probably took place possibly even a little bit before the fall of the Roman Empire. We're
Absolutely.
talking about 476 AD, whenever the Roman Empire fell. So we're at least looking at a Roman citizen within a British world, with it's that influx between the new world and the old world kind of coming together in not a perfect harmony whatsoever. So we're dealing with that as well too. But you said about it being very dark. This is probably the very first major piece to come out of the Dark Ages, as it were.
It was, and it's interesting because I think one of the things that both scholars, archaeologists, and historians have been debating for centuries is in fact there any truth to the King Arthur legend? The shining knights in armor and the Round Table and Lancelot and Guinevere and all that kind of thing is absolutely a part of the Arthur myth, although it does not seem to have much in common with whatever historical basis there is. But there is actually some really intriguing. Oh, hi, Mary Beth. Well, you did in fact make it, so glad to see you aboard. Always nice to have everyone back. But yeah, so but the romantic, chivalrous, romantic version of Arthur we know probably doesn't have much to do with the historic figure that probably inspired Arthur, who may in fact be an amalgam of several different characters. If you wind the clock back to just around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, you have a very, very well-known battle, which interestingly enough is it's uncertain where the battle specifically took place. Many people believe that it took place at this area near Witchhampton in the south of England, which is called Bradbury Hill, or Bradbury Hill Fort, but it's known as the Battle of Baden Hill or Mons Badonicus. And in this battle, which took place in, I guess it was probably around maybe 515 or 520, right around that time, there were the Britons, who at that point were basically a post-Roman people, of course made up as a hodgepodge, were trying to drive back a Saxon invasion. And all sorts of warlords and war chiefs were present at this battle. They did drive back the Saxons. But there is a story by a 6th century monk, often referred to as Gildas the Monk or Gildas the Wise. And Gildas refers to a figure that was present at this battle who was a war chief by the name of Ambrosius Aurelianus. And he talks about this figure fighting alongside the Britons. And although this character isn't King Arthur, he's going to come back and sort of figure in the story of King Arthur a little bit later on. But this is kind of the seed in many ways of what would become the Arthurian myth, is this Battle of Mons Badonicus or Baden Hill, which most scholars agree is at least the sort of the germination of the Arthur myth or the Arthur legend.
Yeah. And whoever's out there that plays Dungeons and Dragons, you're missing out on all these names.
Absolutely. Some really good names actually out there. And half of them are very, very difficult to pronounce, which is even better. It always makes this sort of thing a challenge. But so this character, Ambrosius Aurelianus, is a very, very classically Roman name and appears to have been a war chief of some kind, but certainly doesn't sound anything like Arthur. But as I say, this figure is going to sort of pop up again later and has some very distinct significance in the Arthurian myth. But there is some years later an actual mention of a figure by the name of Arthur, who is supposedly was present at this Battle of Mons Badonicus. And so many, many years later, actually about 200 years after Gildas was writing, another monk called in the 9th century called Nennius refers to a war chief he refers to as a dux bellorum. And a dux bellorum meaning literally sort of a leader of war. It's not an official title. It's actually it's just more of a reference to somebody who led them in battle. So not necessarily somebody who was a general general or who had a specific role assigned to them, but who stepped up and led the battle, which again became very successful for the Britons as they drove back the Saxons at that time. But this Dux Bellorum, this war chief or war leader, was called Arthur. And I'm going to do my best to pronounce some of these Welsh words with a little bit of accuracy here. I actually have to do a shout out before we get too much farther to a fellow by the name of Jimmy, who has a wonderful channel on YouTube called The Welsh Viking. And his research has always been fantastic, and I follow him, and a great deal of what we're talking about tonight is directly as a result of Jimmy's research. So shout out to the Welsh Viking out there. Your channel is a great lifesaver when I'm looking for the accurate story behind some of these wonderful legends. Awesome. But so Arthur, or Arthur, this war chief, supposedly present at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, maybe alongside this fellow Aurelius Ambrosius Aurelianus, and this is a very, very interesting figure because Arthur certainly, or Arthur, wasn't a common name at that time. It is mentioned several times quite specifically in this history of the battle, and this the fact that he gets mentioned is important because, again, you're talking about, this is not any common soldier. This is somebody who rose out of their ranks and proved themselves a true warrior in battle and ended up with a significant, historical impact, enough to be recognized not only by this monk, but then to have his name used again and again in future legends. But what's interesting about this Arthur character is that to be a successful leader in a battle, even if he had not been assigned that role, if he stepped up like that, it would have been a very, very easy thing to be then promoted to a war chief or a warlord. And from that, especially in a tribal society like the Britons were at that time, the step from that to a king-like figure, they may not have even used terms like king at that time, but to become the leader of a tribe or a tribal region would have been a very, very likely result of that. So it may be that his victory at the Battle of Mons Badonicus could have even elevated him to a point of kinghood. So you have, again, this sort of seed now of this, heroic Arthur, who would have risen to become a king among the Britons, not king of Britain, and certainly not king of England, which did not yet exist, but possibly became the sort of germ of that eventual legend.
Yeah, that's a great point because there was no unified England like you were just said, and this was also not the time of huge castles either. This was the time of the motte and bailey, which were basically hill forts covered in a very simple palisade fence, and the moat would have been some sort of dugout structure, almost like a trench, and this was a very difficult time just to survive, and this would have been a very difficult time to wage war and everything else. A lot of blood and guts going on, but as you said, this was going to be a tribal leader, a regional leader, and nowhere near a universal leader of the country itself.
And all across, the British Isles at that point, or Britain at that point, and all the various kingdoms that made up Britain, Caledonia, and all these different, areas that were not even close to unified at that time, were incredibly tribal. And so you had war chiefs, war leaders. All of them were constantly infighting with one another, as well as pushing back against invaders like the Saxons and the Jutes, the Visigoths, and people like that were constantly invading. And so when they weren't fighting with one another, they were banding together sort of loosely to push back invaders. And so there would have never been at that stage a high king that was that sort of lorded over everyone, but to rise to a position of kingship or leadership and become a war chief in one of these tribes was no small thing. Now, even later than Nennius the monk's reference to the Battle of Mons Badonicus, which specifically references this Arthur figure, a collection of documents that came to be known as the Annales Cambriae, which is the Annals of Wales, was a compiled history made up of multiple different documents, probably not actually pulled together till around the 1200s or so, but maybe written earlier, maybe in the 9th or the 10th century. But this one also mentions this war chief Arthur, but also fascinatingly brings up the figures of Mordred and Merlin, or Myrdin, another Welsh name, which literally means a dark bird, and was probably a reference to a hawk or a falcon of some kind. But so Arthur Mordred, who we know from the Arthurian legends, and Myrdin, the great sage that we think of, the wizard from the Arthurian legends, all mentioned as present, in this battle, which is remarkable because these figures don't really start to become part of the Arthurian myth for still a couple of centuries to come, because at this point there was no Arthurian myth. There were simply historic figures, and most people hadn't even hadn't even associated these figures with one another. In fact, the presence of this character called Mordred, the presence of this figure called Myrddin, and Arthur all being here, they may not have ever even interacted with one another. It doesn't say in there that they knew each other, that they were good friends. It doesn't claim that Myrddin or Merlin was a wizard. It just mentions that they're present. But that right there it's pretty tantalizing when you're trying to find out if these historic figures exist, that suddenly to have all three of these very significant figures from later Arthurian myth placed at the same battle, in early Britain, all basically in the presence, or at least, associated with this war chief who could have rose to a position of kingship. So it is interesting that it seems like it is building the blocks for this legend to come.
So we have the names and we have the characters. Now we just need a very literate poet to put all this stuff together.
We do indeed. And there were a couple of them that were about to come rolling down the line. One of these was a fellow by the name of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later on. But some later chronicles did end up identifying the character of Ambrosius Aurelianus, who we spoke earlier of, who was definitely present at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, and referred to him by not a Roman name, but a Welsh name, Myrddin Emrys, another name for Merlin. And so it's fascinating to suggest that possibly this figure, this Ambrosius figure, might actually have been the figure that was known later as Merlin. But this is definitely speculation. I mean, it's pure speculation, but it's certainly one that's very interesting. The name Myrddin wasn't completely unheard of, but again, you're placing it in context and it starts to be pretty fascinating. Aspects of the Ambrosius Aurelianus figure and an earlier war chief called Lucius Arturus, as in Arthur, Castus, may have even been incorporated into the character of Arthur, not merely Merlin. So now what you actually have is these characters, or these figures, historic figures, who may actually have been jumbled together and partially been sort of composited from different figures. So possibly both Merlin and Arthur taking on, historically speaking, or rather legendarily speaking, aspects of different historic figures. And so it's almost like they were turning sort of this myth into a Frankenstein. But
and anybody that's ever studied Shakespearean literature or really studied history of the Middle Ages, you're going to be haunted over and over again by Geoffrey of Monmouth, because a lot of what he said was just taken as fact. So everybody since that time wrote it as if it was genuine history of England. And that's why it's so difficult to really kind of peel back that onion and find out what really was at the core.
And as far as we can tell, much of the sort of structure that he created, where he started, sort of weaving this myth of Arthur the King, was effectively just manufactured, whether it was taken from a combination of these historic figures, partially from probably myths that were common among the people. So again, you've got things like the risen king myth, or the risen, God myth. That was something that would have been very, very common throughout Roman Empire, throughout the, we talked about them in our previous show, throughout the Celtic lands. They were there in Britain. And so all of the building blocks were certainly there for these things. And to incorporate a historic figure into these stories was certainly not unusual. So,
and Geoffrey, also being part of the Middle Ages, also Catholic culture. So he was projecting a lot of his culture onto the past as well.
In fact, one of the interesting later stories, when it refers to the sort of the war chief Arthur riding into battle at Mons Badonicus, claims that he had a shield emblazoned with the figure of the Virgin Mary on it. And that's something that doesn't seem to exist in any of the historic records, but ends up becoming incorporated into it later, because most of these heroes end up sort of, even if they come from a pre-Christian or an early, sort of early pagan culture, end up adopting a Christian identity as the Christian church, grew and sort of flourished and became sort of more established.
Sure. One of the interesting things is that Constantine, who of course, was all responsible for the legalization of Christianity, he actually had his seat of power in York, England. So he did have a place there in England. I'm sure that was part of the mythology as well, too. So whenever we see the Battle of Milvian Bridge, he had his soldiers paint the Chi Rho on their shields. And of course, from then on out, that they were able to conquer in the name of God, as it were, and have a unified kingdom. So I think a lot of this is going on in the myth building of Arthur himself.
Oh, absolutely. And again, they're trying to create this, effectively this, sainted, almost sainted character.
Right.
And and that's something that was very important to the Christian people, is to have these champions who were effectively, representatives of God on
Right.
earth, which is how the God King idea, which becomes so common in so many other cultures, ends up taking hold, and the divine right of a king to rule becomes a very crucial part, certainly, of English myth and lore.
Right. If I could just backpack on that or a little bit there, so by the time we get to Spencer and his Fairy Queen, we do now see within the literary aspect, at least, that Arthur has now become a saint. So by the late 1600s, we already have the idea that Arthur is a saint within the mythology of the. So he's canonized within the literature of the time. Let us say.
Yeah, and again, this was something that was not uncommon with these, with these heroic figures, is to sort of have the church claim these heroes as, champions of the church, was hugely important and influential, because these mythic champions, which are often very popular stories, very popular with the people, to make them champions of the church brought people even closer to the church.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So it was a very effective method of growing your congregation.
And it also allowed them to hold on to their pagan ways as well, too. That part of them they really didn't want to let go.
Oh, very much so. In fact, we've certainly talked about that more than a few times over the course of our many shows, and it will come up again later. Not necessarily in the Arthur context, but when we get to Robin Hood, there's some really interesting examples of that within the Robin Hood mythology as well. So the ultimate question really comes down, and I mean, I guess in some ways we've already answered it, but the question is, did King Arthur exist? And the answer is almost certainly, but the post-Roman war chief of Britain's history was likely very different from the romantic and chivalrous legend that we know today. There is no evidence of a round table, the faithless Queen Guinevere, Sir Lancelot, a noble quest for the Holy Grail. But it is fascinating to realize that figures like Merlin and Mordred may indeed have been a real part of Merlin's story, of Arthur's story. So bits of the legend that followed later on may actually be more reflective of history than I think people would often suggest or often believe. And I have to say, this was even fairly new to me. I had always known that there was a historic figure allegedly behind the character of King Arthur, but I knew even that there was possibly a historic Merlin somewhere. But the fact that they're placed in the same context along with another figure called Mordred, it's a nice gift to see, to have that much of the Arthurian legend actually reflected in an aspect of history. And so for me, somebody who loves to see legends brought to life, I think it's a nice little Easter egg, part of the sort of pun there, hiding within the Arthurian myth.
Yeah, from a psychological and philosophical point of view, if these characters and these events did not indeed take place factually, they should have. So we actually had somebody to write it up as if it did, and we're better for it. We're better for it as a culture.
I believe, I think, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think Truman Capote is the one who said, I don't lie, I write history the way it should have happened. And I thought that, or something, I'm paraphrasing him a little bit, but I think it is a wonderful way to look at life, is that...
Yeah, and before we leave, we have to understand that, too, that this made such an impact that without the Arthur legend, we would not have Star Wars. We wouldn't have all these basic things that we take for granted within our life.
No, of course, and we're talking earlier about Joseph Campbell, and for those of you who are not familiar with Joseph Campbell, he was an anthropologist, and I think was it in the 80s that he put out his his wonderful book that describes sort of the hero's journey, and talked about the way that most of these great historic and mythic figures sort of all conform to a very, very classic style of journey. You have often a tragic upbringing or beginning, often with parents, dying, or some terrible tragedy at birth, someone trying to kill you like Moses, or things like that. Disney films always seem to start this way as well, and Disney often uses the hero's journey model, and then grows up under some kind of a depressed circumstance, leaves home, ends up getting into all sorts of mischief, comes into their own, overcomes some terrible sort of tragedy, great trials, finds the hero within, and then kind of becomes this, godlike or very, very virtuous figure. And that this hero's journey occurs again and again and again all throughout human history, even in cultures that don't appear to have any connection. And so it is a very, very, sort of core idea that seems to be born or baked into the human consciousness.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the reason in Kabuki theater in Asia, you can put on plays like Hamlet and King Lear and Macbeth because it still has cultural reference or relevance, even though they don't understand the references, British.
Absolutely. So to talk about Mr. Monmouth again, Geoffrey of Monmouth, he was a 12th century chronicler, and his History of the Kings of Britain, or Historia Regum Britanniae, collected all these various fragments of the Arthur story. Basically, the historic figures, little bits of myth and pieces. You've got Merlin and Mordred and all these different things, and he took them and he sort of put him in his sort of blender and mixed them up with all these different ideas, and some that were entirely unique to himself. But he also utilized a book that was written right around the same time, maybe published a little bit before his own, referred to as the Prophecies of Merlin, and came up with this risen king myth, and ultimately wove the first fairly comprehensive version of the Arthur myth that we would later come to know. But the Prophecies of Merlin specifically were about, also again published in the 12th century, along with Monmouth's Life of Merlin, both associated the wizard with Ambrosius. And so now this figure, who was a historic character at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, has been almost officially referred to as now Myrddin Ambrosius, or Ambrosius Myrddin, Merlin, the wizard, the seer, the prophesier. But he's actually inspired most likely by an even earlier figure, a Welsh figure known as Myrddin Wilt. Myrddin Wilt he was basically called Merlin the Mad. He was a historical figure who was a Welsh bard and seer who apparently ended up going into the woods, going entirely mad, living among the animals, and then being believed to be both mad but also wise, as is a very common thing that you see in folklore. And interestingly enough, however, the literal existence of this Myrddin Wilt, or Merlin of the Wild character, would actually place him about a decade or so later than the war chief Arthur. So if in fact he existed, and became a template for Merlin, he was not the Merlin or this Ambrosius figure that we would find at the Battle of Mont Badonicus. So now where we have this, the schism where this possibly real historic figure may have been one of the bases of the later fictional Merlin, but not the same Myrddin that would have been with Arthur at Mons Badonicus. So it's not an easy one-to-one thing. This does not all fall neatly in line like a puzzle piece. Sometimes you actually have to struggle a bit to make these figures connect, but people do. And that's the thing, is many of these chroniclers of the time were absolutely determined to make these characters fit together. And so if they had to twist history and bend the rules a little bit to fit these characters together and create their myth, they were bound and determined to do it.
Yeah, you can get a round peg into a square hole if you push hard enough.
Yeah, you just need a mallet. And
that's right, exactly.
They had a big mallet, and they did everything in their power to make these work. Yes. It's not that that's necessarily a bad thing. The truth is that, again, these myths, human myths, are bigger necessarily than the people that they're based on, because the myths have to take on these, iconic, immortal concepts. And people are not immortal, Arthur, the war chief, Myrddin Ambrosius, these different figures, they were not immortal, and they were not necessarily magical figures, even if they were great men in their time. But they have to become immortal, and they have to become greater than the sum of their parts. And that's what that mallet, that sort of metaphorical mallet, is for, is to hammer them into shape and forge this legend from there. Pardon me, I'm kind of running with the metaphor.
Speaking of forging, we got to get to the sword.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the sword is a very big part of this, but there is one particular person, possibly greater than anyone else, who absolutely locked the legend in, and that would be Sir Thomas Malory. In 1485, Malory took Geoffrey of Monmouth's stories. He took French legends. He took all these different reworked versions of Arthur, and he created what many people would still probably call today the definitive history of Arthur. Le Mort d'Arthur literally means the death of Arthur, referring to, again, this sort of sacrificial king idea. But he set the king's legend in stone. Again, pardon the constant punning here, but firmly established nearly every major facet of the story for centuries to come, including his lineage, the sort of the Uther Pendragon being raised by Merlin, and then later in the underneath Sir Kay and Sir I think can never remember the name of the father figure, but the training under Merlin, his eventual marriage to Guinevere, the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Grail, and his eventual fall at the hands of his misbegotten son Mordred. Now, this is the basis of so many later versions of the Merlin of the Arthur myth. In fact, the movie Excalibur, which was, I believe, 1981, still remains to this day one of the most, sort of visually gorgeous and stunning versions of the Arthur myth, is almost taken directly, scene for scene, from Le Morte d'Arthur. Although certainly a very shortened version of it, because this is quite a tome. If you're ever in the mood to read a 600-year-old or 500-year-old book about King Arthur, it's worth reading, but it's no easy process to get through this massive chunk of ancient prose.
Not a walk in the park, and not always as fun as you would think that it would be. Not a lot of battles in that, or there's battles in it, but there's a lot of talking as well too.
Yeah. But despite the fact that Mallory did really kind of lock in so much of the myth, there is one aspect of the myth that he did not create. I mean, there's a lot of aspects he didn't create, but there's one particular one that has absolutely hung on over the years, and it's one I think most of us are intimately familiar with, and that is the iconic sword in the stone. Of course, everyone knows of Arthur's sacred sword Excalibur, the sword of power, sword of magic, sword of kings, etc. But that actually came from a French author who actually based his original stories, again, in the 12th century, possibly the early 13th century. Now, he took this story and he turned it into a very, very romantic French epic. The particulars of Excalibur's origin as Arthur's sword, pulled from a stone on Christmas Day, not just a stone, but a stone with an anvil atop it. And that when he pulled the sword from the stone, the sword was emblazoned with the words that, he who draweth this sword from the stone is rightwise king of all England. At the time, it would have said Britain, I'm sure. But this was this is sort of the central heroic concept of the Arthur myth, is that this boy of humble beginnings, who has no idea that he is the child of the true king of Britain at the time, Uther Pendragon, accidentally draws this sword from the stone in a noble act, actually attempting to bring the sword to his brother who was fighting in a tournament that day, but unknowingly takes this sword from a churchyard on Christmas Day and suddenly is blessed to become the king of all England. So it's one of the most romantic aspects of the entire Arthur legend. And of course, the sword Excalibur itself becomes the key element of the Arthur myth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a hint in here historically that we might go as far back as the Bronze Age, meeting the Iron Age with the forging of Excalibur. There's one particular theory out there that when we talk about pulling the sword from the stone, it's actually a memory of the actual forging of it and putting it into a mold, and then the sword comes out whole from the stone. Okay, that's a very interesting, especially if Excalibur was indeed made out of iron instead of bronze, a much more superior weapon, right? And the other thing with the association of the anvil, it looks as if there is an idea of smelting and blacksmithing going on as well too, in the actual creation of the sword.
And I've heard that idea before, and it is interesting, sort of the metaphorical idea that it is specifically a metaphor for sort of creating a sword from the raw elements and everything, and it's a fascinating one. It's interesting also that the name Excalibur is a Latinized version of a much older word as well. So. In Welsh, it would be Caladwich or Caliburn, and this iconic sword is actually it's two Welsh words, the Caled meaning to cleave or to cut, and Wilch meaning literally a valley or a cleft. And so basically the name Excalibur, or rather Caliburn, Caladwich, would literally have meant the great cleaver, the great sword capable of cleaving something, or the great hard cleft. And so effectively the name of the sword is powerful sword, and it's funny because it may not have been specific to Arthur's sword. There's actually evidence to suggest that Caliburn or Excalibur was the French ended up calling it, was a common use word for a sword of great value or a sword of great quality, but that of course it becomes iconicized, it becomes the
Right.
great sword, and that by the time it's been fully Latinized to become Excalibur or Excalibur, as it's seen in some of the old French versions of it, it is now not just any sword, but the great sword of Arthur. It's also interesting to note that depending on the version you read, sometimes Excalibur and the Sword in the Stone are different swords.
Absolutely.
Because remember that also that Arthur is given the sword in many of the legends by this mythical lady of the lake, this goddess figure, and this again, the drawing the sword from the water. You have a very, very classic Celtic myth here with this water spirit, and so that's at odds with the idea of the sword in the stone. That the sword of kings drawn from the stone and Excalibur, the sword of power, were actually meant to be two different things. But we are getting into some sort of mythic gray area when we discuss that.
But finding swords in a bog or in a pond was also very commonplace, because many people would throw, especially if defeat looked imminent, they would actually take their weapons and throw them into places such as that, so the enemy could not get their hands on that. So that's also a cultural memory of actual events as well.
And that's so much of what myth is basically later reflections of things that were true once, or that actually have some kind of a deeper meaning, and sort of cobbled together to be cohesive stories when once they were just fragments. And it's how we remember our past and how we remember our history. It's one of the reasons that legends and folklore are so important to us, is because they hold these kernels of wisdom, often which we lose the ability to see through the passage of time. So I believe I actually already said this specifically, but so the legendary sword name does derive from the wealth Khaled and Wilk, the great hard cleaver, but the name would later be Latinized again by other writers, and eventually Excalibur becomes Excalibur. Now, the modern Arthurian myth is largely manufactured, and that's something that we certainly need to remember. Locations across England, such as Tintagel, where supposedly Uther, bedded a grain and gave birth to Arthur. In Cornwall, all of these different figures, the Isle of Avalon, are mythic completely and don't have any direct connection to the historic figures. These are all the elements of the myth that would come along much later. But I don't think that in any way invalidates them. And again, these are very, very mythic, but these myths are very powerful, and the magic is important to us because, as we were just saying a moment ago, these myths define who we are. They're the way we remember important, sort of life lessons. Arthur's story, a very, very classic hero's journey, and they do end up becoming greater than the sum of their parts. So whoever this historic Arthur, the Dux Bellorum of the Battle of Mons Badonicus may have been, he may have been the seed that gave birth to this legend, but the legend has become much bigger, and I think ultimately, will be remembered long after we forget who Arthur, the war chief, ever was.
And Christopher, looking over the history of Great Britain, why wouldn't you want to attach yourself to this legend? I mean, even Scotland up in Edinburgh has Arthur's Seat, and a place up in Stirling has a place that is believed to be the site of Arthur's Castle as well too. So the whole way from Scotland over to Wales and all these other places in between all have great legends, local legends that said Arthur slept here, almost like George Washington. I think it's very interesting that it so captured the imagination that he has become almost a political figure, although he may have never existed like that.
And interestingly enough, too, I mean, we talked about the risen king aspect of the Arthur story. There is a very specific reason Arthur is referred to as the once and future king, because the story of Arthur says that when Arthur, dies in final battle with Mordred, that he is carried away, to the Isle of Avalon, basically this sort of, heavenly spiritual island that really is the fairy realm, sort of carried on wholesale from old Celtic mythology, but that in England's time of greatest need, that Arthur would rise again, and that he would reclaim, Excalibur, and he would rise again to rule and to save the England from his darkest times. Well, I will say this much: England has had plenty of dark times since then, and so obviously none of them have been quite dark enough to summon Arthur from the grave. But we can always keep our fingers crossed and hope for that one. So,
but before we move on, one thing that you said a couple weeks ago is very pertinent to kind of wrap up the Arthur legend. That you said Arthur is England and England is Arthur, right?
Yeah, the king is the land, the land is the king. Absolutely,
exactly right. So we also see this chthonic figure as well too of Arthur being placed within the very womb of England, from whence he will return. And not only that, but also the idea of Merlin as well. Even though this is a pagan figure, practicing wizardry and everything, the idea that he still slumbers within a cave somewhere in England
Oh yeah.
is also shows that this kind of rebirth will come to pass eventually when needed most.
Yeah, and the idea that, again, that these sort of carry the thread of much older religions, much older gods, into the 12th century, 13th century, 15th, 20th, and even into modern times. And when we see these, the reason that they touch us the way they do, the reason that these 1,000-year-old stories still resonate and are made again and again into films is because that old magic still touches something deep within us. And so I think that's very, very important.
And very literally, that magic, that pagan magic, was Christianized to the point that it's acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's face it. I mean, you are a Catholic, is that correct?
I am, yeah,
So
yeah.
you guys have smells and bells like crazy. You've got
Absolutely.
the big crazy robes and incense and the wands and everything else. I mean, that's as magical as anything I've ever seen. So
I agree 100%.
we're keeping the candle burning.
There's more awe and reverence, I think, whenever you look at it that way, though. I really do think that is the case.
So next, we're going to move on to a character who actually has a great deal in common with King Arthur in many ways, and this would be, of course, Robin Hood, easily as famous as King Arthur, the famed outlaw of Sherwood Forest, who was an everyman hero, fights for the downtrodden against tyranny, against an unjust king and his enforcers. But although that description doesn't make him sound very much like King Arthur, other than his nobility, there is quite a lot in common between the two figures. First of all, both raised in very humble surroundings, although there is some play in this, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But both raised in humble surroundings and then become known for their nobility, their sort of inborn nobility. Arthur becomes crowned as King of England. Robin is always referred to as the King of Sherwood, both surrounded by a loyal band, and of Arthur has his knights. Robin Hood has his outlaws, the merry men versus the Knights of the Round Table, both active in fighting against tyranny. Both end up betraying and being killed by a close relative, and ultimately die beside their most trusted and valued friend. In this case of Arthur, it's usually Percival or Lancelot, depending on the version of the story. And Robin Hood dies in the arms of Little John, who holds him up as he fires the arrow, which would ultimately choose where his grave becomes. But these figures actually, despite the fact that they are polar opposites, one being a nobleman and the other being essentially a peasant, are actually remarkably similar in their myths, and both actually also have that risen king or sacrificed hero idea that later becomes very important to them. It is, however, I think Robin Hood is looked down upon a little bit more than the King Arthur myth, because while King Arthur is still very noble, and again, the knights and the swords and everything else is all very impressive and chivalrous, but when we think of Robin Hood, I think it's very hard not to think of the cliched image of the campy swordplay, swinging from the trees, brightly colored tights, etc. But just like the Arthur legend, there is a much darker aspect to this, especially since the outlaws of medieval England were often very common people that were driven to crime by unjust laws. And sometimes not just driven to crime, but sometimes just life was a crime. These people were often denied the ability to do something as simple as go into the woods and hunt to kill a rabbit to feed their family. The king's forestry laws basically said that all the forests of England, because at this time England had now very firmly been established, that all the forests of England belonged to the king, and they were his hunting territory, and only the king's foresters, essentially his enforcers, could hunt in the forest. So even if your family was starving, you were not allowed to walk into the forest behind your own house and hunt for a rabbit or a squirrel to feed your family. If you were caught doing that, you could have your hands chopped off or your eyes put out. So it was a very dark time, and this is the aspect of sort of 11th or 12th century England that gives birth to the Robin Hood legend.
Yeah, there was also a capital offense to go into the woods and gather fallen twigs for your fire.
Yeah,
I mean, it was that
firewood or berries or anything.
Absolutely.
It's a very dark time, and again, there's a reason that this oppression, led to some of the rebellions that it did. But interestingly enough, again, we're going to we're going to go a little bit backwards from the way we did the Arthur story. We're going to discuss the real Robin Hood a little bit later. But first, we want to talk a little bit about the myth of it. The first mention in literature of Robin Hood actually comes from a story that has nothing to do directly with Robin Hood, and that was a very, very early sort of a ribald story called Piers Plowman. Now, Piers Plowman was written in the 14th century, and it's a great prose poem. And it's mostly like so many of the stories were at that time, a morality play. But in one particular scene, when this sort of layabout, lazy sort of character is confronted by a priest who thinks that he is a sinner and and a ne'er-do-well, the figure essentially confirms it by saying, "I ken not the paternoster as the priest singeth it, but I ken the rhymes of Robin Hood." Literally, he's saying, "I don't know how to say the Lord's Prayer, but I do remember the rhymes of Robin Hood." It's an interesting thing because what he's saying is that I'm illiterate, I can't read, but I remember these stories that are shared around the fire. And basically, the rhymes of Robin Hood were, in a way, considered, well, they weren't just in a way, they were considered to be very lowbrow. They were the absolute base level of entertainment, because they were shared not in any written way. They weren't morality plays or anything. They were comedies. They were primarily comedies, and you heard them from passing minstrels or for people who remembered stories well enough to tell them. In fact, at this point, almost all of the stories of Robin Hood that existed at that time were in the form of ballads. And so these ballads were sung from town to town by these wandering minstrels and troubadours. And they would basically wander from town to town. They would sing, they would strum, they would hope for a few pennies or maybe a night's lodging and a little bit of a meal. And this is how the stories of Robin Hood made the rounds. But they became the absolute hit of this period in time, this early medieval period, because people loved the stories, because virtually every Robin Hood story involved this outlaw, and everyone at this point either knew someone who had become an outlaw for all these unjust reasons, or were in danger of becoming them themselves. So in a way, outlaws were kind of like folk heroes, just by virtue of existing. As long as they didn't steal from you, you weren't too bothered by them. But Robin Hood would always confront abbots and bishops and greedy merchants, and he would basically teach them a lesson. And so to the people, this was wonderful. This was all the stories of watching the people who made your life miserable get their comeuppance. So Robin Hood had become this massively popular folk figure, and people loved these ballads, but they were considered very, very in poor taste by the ruling class, and certainly by the church.
Yeah. There's something very subversive about it as well, too, and rebellious, right? Because it's turning the natural order upside down.
Exactly. And then the idea of celebrating an outlaw, in fact, they literally refer to him often as the celebrated outlaw Robin Hood, was mortifying, and so this is something that for this character in Piers Plowman, this popular and again fairly ribald story, to say, "I don't know the Lord's Prayer, but I can recite the rhymes of Robin Hood," was saying, I have no moral character whatsoever in the eyes of the people, but in a way that was considered to be funny and charming.
Yeah, and also I know where my priorities lay.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, there's this little bit of a subtext in here too, which is that this being written, in the 1400s, suggests that by that time the stories were already widespread. So Robin Hood isn't a character from the 1300s; he's probably a character from the 1200s or the 1100s or earlier, because this was now common knowledge, not something that anyone wouldn't fail to recognize. So it was obviously a very, very well-known cultural reference by the time Piers Plowman was published.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I think it's maintained such a position in the thought and the imagination, in my opinion, in my historical outlook on things, I think he actually derived before the Norman conquest. I think that was something that was uniquely British before any kind of conquest, and that is what reason it remains with us today.
The placement of Robin Hood in context of King Richard and the and the later 1300s or whatever, instead of around the time of the Norman conquest, which was 1066, is largely because of Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe.
Right.
Ivanhoe is the first major piece of literature, of prose literature, that actually features Robin Hood as a character. I think a lot of people forget that Robin Hood is a fairly significant character in the story of Ivanhoe, which takes place, when the Normans have already conquered England, and it establishes Robin Hood as a Saxon figure against the Normans in Norman England, in the heart of that conflict. And so that became an inextricable part of the Robin Hood legend for the next centuries to come. But before that time, he didn't necessarily have that political leaning, because this was, again, in the age of William the Conqueror, when, again, the figure probably began to emerge, possibly from, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, possibly from, once again, an old pagan root. And that is a fascinating, very fascinating aspect of the Robin Hood myth. But Robin Hood was entirely a subject of these ballads and poems, and the first prose tales of him would not appear until the 17th century. And that was actually in the form of stage plays. Because, again, most people couldn't read at that time, but you could easily go and you could see a local theater troupe or, traveling troupe perform these Robin Hood plays. But the most likely place that you would actually see these plays would be at festivals, seasonal festivals. However, in the 17th century, again, around the time of Ivanhoe, Robin Hood had in a sense been tamed. And this is a very important part of the Robin Hood legend, because Robin Hood was originally a yeoman. He was a common forester who, according to most of the old stories, runs afoul of the law somehow. In most cases, he runs across a group of the king's foresters, and the foresters tease him because he's quite young. He's got his little bow with him, and he's on his way, to town to shoot in the tournament. And the foresters look at this, young kid with this stripling kid, and they start harassing him, and with his bow, and they say, "What are you going to do with that thing anyway?" And they challenge him to strike a deer, who's grazing in the forest nearby. And so Robin proves them wrong, makes fools of them by shooting the deer. But because even though he's done this at the request of the foresters, they have no intention of being made fools of, and so they immediately attempt to arrest him for killing a deer. So they railroad him, turn him into an outlaw, and this young boy ends up running off into the forest. He then becomes, Robin of Locksley, which is the sort of earlier version of it. But in the 14th, the 15th, and into the 16th century, the Robin Hood story was co-opted by the gentry. And because it was so popular, they wanted to take sort of control of this legend. And so Robin of Locksley became Robert of Huntingdon. And Robert of Huntingdon was no longer a yeoman. He was a noble lord who was displaced, as a result of a bad land deal or a land dispute, and ends up having his lands taken away from him. But now he's gentry. And so he goes to live in the woods with the outlaws in order to clear his name and regain his title as the Lord of Huntingdon. And now he basically is this noble figure who gets to be the sort of huzzah, ha ha outlaw that we would come to remember. So it's a very, very different perspective on Robin Hood, and creates this interesting dichotomy of the noble and the peasant Robin Hood, who were very, very different characters, even in the way they're portrayed in their respective legends. So an interesting split in these two figures.
Yeah, the noble Robin Hood just simply doesn't work for me.
It when it is handled well, it can be a very fun conceit, and I've seen plenty of versions of both portrayed in films. And in being a big Robin Hood fan, I don't mind it. But no, it's the common man yeoman Robin Hood that always sort of appeals to me more. If I was going to live in the forest, I wouldn't want to go back to a castle. I think I'd love to live there and live off mutton and venison for the rest of my life.
Well,
it's an outlaw's dream.
That's right.
Interestingly enough, however, as I say, the actual origins of Robin Hood probably date back quite a lot earlier than even these ballads. The truth is that in the early years, the hooded man legend was frowned upon by the church, not merely because he was an outlaw, but also because he was very often a representation of older heathen gods, still celebrated at May Day and other seasonal festivals beloved by the common folk. In fact, if you take a look at Robin Hood with his green outfit, living in the woods, with his circle of friends, it's actually not too difficult to see the old pagan sort of fairy figure of Robin Goodfellow. And certainly there's a not too subtle coincidence in those names in the mischievous figure of Robin Hood. So in 1555, just to cement the fact that this is exactly what the church thought of him, the Scottish Parliament decreed that no one should act as Robin Hood, Little John, the Abbot of Unreason, or the the Fool's Abbot, or the Queen of the May. All of these figures were very, very common figures portrayed in the May Day or Beltane pagan festivals that happened every year in the May. But the Robin Hood plays, or Robin Hood sort of mummers plays that were common in these, were considered ribald and full of sort of sexual innuendo and pagan symbolism, and very, very frowned upon by the church. And they were considered to be keeping the people mired in sin and paganism. So Robin Hood became the tentpole figure of this pagan survival. But interestingly enough, the old legends do contain references to Robin Hood and Will Scarlet, and to Little John and Will Scarlet, a few of the characters who would later become part of the Robin Hood myths. However, it was in the May festivals that some of the most significant characters in the Robin Hood myth actually were introduced, and that would be Maid Marian and Friar Tuck, who actually came from completely different traditions. They were both part of other pastoral plays that were commonly performed at the May Games. This character of Marian was often portrayed again as the May Queen, this fairy queen figure, and Friar Tuck was this Abbot of Unreason, this sort of meant to be comical, angry, and very, very foolish church figure, clergy figure, who was meant to lampoon the clergy. So as you can imagine, again, the church was not at all happy about that, but the church did in fact decide that they were going to shut the May Day festivals down altogether. And about a century after the Scottish Parliament stopped them from performing Robin Hood plays, they tried to outlaw Beltane festivals altogether. And considering the fact that at that point they were burning people, for heresy, it was pretty successful for a while.
Yeah, it's probably pretty safe at that time to go put your green tights away. Probably not the safest bet to.
Indeed. In fact,
bring those things around.
The funny part is as comical as green tights are when we see them in all the old movies, that is in many ways effectively what people were wearing back then. They often refer to it as hose, but you were actually sewn into a fairly tight pair of pants, and so most of these people would have been running around in tights of one kind or another. Maybe not lycra tights the way we see them today, but hose weren't a whole lot different. So that, in one particular aspect of the Robin Hood myth, is actually probably pretty accurate.
And he was wearing green, so he was camouflaged.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lincoln green was actually very hard to come by. And so the fact that Robin Hood, again, his men could afford to wear green clothing and green dye was probably a fact because of the fact that they were very, very successful at robbing these fat bishops of their pouches of coins. What Robin Hood would often do, again, especially in the old stories, which were meant to be at least partially comedies, is he would encounter this fat bishop or greedy merchant on the road. He would either set up some kind of a challenge for him or ask him to pay a toll. If the figure agreed to pay the toll and pass on peacefully, Robin Hood and his men would allow them to pass on. But if they claimed that they were poor, or tried to cover up the fact that they were carrying wealth, they would end up stripped of everything and usually sent packing, nearly naked or just wearing their small clothes tied to a horse and riding off in the distance. And so there was a sense of justice in Robin Hood. Other times he would invite these people that he met in the woods to dinner, in his palace, which was his woodland realm, feed them a fine meal, and then at the end he would ask them to pay for it. And again, if they refused to pay, they were often even given a pretty thorough thrashing. So they still maintained this idea of it punishing the wicked and rewarding the virtuous, which was always an aspect of the Robin Hood myth.
A great morality tale.
But I have to say, just as a little bit of an aside, I think one of the most extraordinary versions of Robin Hood that's ever been made, and I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see this, but I highly recommend it if anyone is fascinated by the character of Robin Hood, was in the 1980s. A fellow named Richard Carpenter, who worked for the British channel ITV, produced a series with 26 total episodes overall, which retold the Robin Hood legend, and it added back in all those elements of magic and paganism. They had the seasonal festivals, magic magical, we had, evil bishops, we had sorcerers and all this kind of thing. And it's a fascinating show because it was not done for laughs. It was actually done very dark and very gritty. They filmed on location in all these beautiful castles all throughout England and Wales. And it became a huge, huge hit. And it also did something which is remarkable, which is that about halfway through the run of the show, the main character, an actor by the name of Michael Praed, who was playing Robin of Locksley, the classic yeoman, this peasant figure who becomes Robin Hood, is killed off. And in the next season, when it begins, this mysterious hooded figure arrives who appears to be Robin Hood. And at the end of the episode is revealed to be a young man by the name of Robert of Huntingdon, the son of an earl. And so they actually portray both versions of it. But they came up with this brilliant idea, which very much honored old pagan traditions, that the Robin Hood legend or the Robin Hood mantle was not a person, but it was actually a mantle given to you by the horned god of the woods, this Celtic figure who chose a son of Herne, this sort of figure to be his representative on earth, almost a Christ figure. So it's a fascinating show. Again, if you ever get a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. Beautifully done, has music by a wonderful Celtic band called Clannad, which is a little dated today, but it's still a wonderful show and very, very much worth.
I gotta check it out.
So I want to make a note, folks, that we're actually at the 10 o'clock hour right now, but as this is our season finale, if you'll stick with us for a few minutes, we will soldier on and have just a few more to get through. So hopefully you'll stick around for the last few minutes of the show. Because I do want to talk about the fact that Robin Hood, although much more specifically mythic or mythical, maybe than the Arthur legend, which is often grounded in a little bit more reality, still does have some very, very interesting possible basis in history. People often ask if Robin Hood is real. We've seen the trickster outlaw of the popular ballads, the disinherited nobleman, and all these different characters. But what about the real Robin Hood? And the answer is that there may, in fact, have been at least a template for this figure. If you actually look in the surviving legal documents, and there actually are quite a few that still survive from that era, you actually find multiple references to outlaws and criminals that in some way seem to echo the Robin Hood myth. So after a fashion, the answer is yes, he may well have been real. So in the 12th and 13th centuries, you have figures such as, let me see, I'm going to actually jump forward real quick and say figures such as Robin Hood, who is referenced specifically as a fugitive that was had all of his belongings taken away. So actually sounds very much like the Huntingdon myth in that one. And that was in 1226. Another speaks of a member of a band of outlaws awaiting trial whose name was William Robhod or Robhod. And any of these and many others that still exist from that day may have in fact either inspired the legend or possibly taken the name, much as the way, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride, but you probably remember in The Princess Bride, you have the pirate whose name, once again, is passed on from pirate to pirate, the Dread Pirate Roberts. It's possible that these outlaws actually took on the name of Robin Hood or Robin Hood, all of the different variations on it, in order to strike fear into the hearts of people. So they may have, in fact, adopted the mantle of Robin Hood in order to carry on the legend and become a greater, threat or a greater outlaw. So it's possible that the myth influenced the reality, and the reality influenced the myth in equal measure.
Absolutely.
So I like to just point out that with both of these figures, they're both medieval characters, and nowadays, I think probably as much as there ever were, medieval mythology is something that is massively popular. I think maybe it's because it's a time of great romance and chivalry, this sort of great medieval fantasies or medieval style fantasies between J.R.R. Tolkien, Game of Thrones, shows like Robin Hood. We've got all these wonderful programs, all these wonderful novels. If you walk into any fantasy section of a bookstore, so much of it is medieval fantasy and mythology, and I think it has a special romance that really, really strikes home. And sometimes people say that it is overused. I would have to disagree. I think it's really one of the most wonderful settings for mythic fantasy, and to me has always been very, very special. Robin Hood and King Arthur, both two of the most, I think, wondrous characters of ancient medieval fantasy, and with luck will continue to be recreated for future generations. generations over and over again, as they often are. And that's a really interesting point, is that these characters don't simply stay in the medieval era. We have characters that exemplify them in later, in later mythology as well. You were saying earlier that without King Arthur, we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have a lot of these later myths. The same is true of Robin Hood. You even have them, exemplified in superhero figures like Green Arrow, in the DC universe, or the Black Knight, who's an Arthurian figure. So they do get reinvented for later generations, and I think that's a wonderful aspect of these myths.
And I think Peter Pan is perpetually playing Robin Hood as well too.
Very much so. And honestly, again, you've got that Puck-like figure, this, sort of this Robin Goodfellow Puck immortal figure here, who again has the swashbuckling aspect. And so very much, I would imagine, inspired by aspects of both the Robin Hood legend and the fairy legends of old. So
Absolutely.
Something that hopefully will never go away.
That's right. This was a great show. I think that this was a great way to end up things, because there was it's more lighthearted. Nobody got killed. No blood, no demons.
So, and I don't mind an occasional demon-free episode. So yeah, just as a quick reminder to everybody out there, this is in fact our last show of the season, which means that we will be taking our summer hiatus. Both Ron and I have a whole lot going on, and so we are in fact going on hiatus. So Myths, Mysteries, and Monsters will be back in August with brand new episodes, and of course we will post updates as we have better idea, and we will make sure that everybody knows when we are returning for the season. We are very much hoping possibly to do a summer sort of a special later on, when Ron is up in this neighborhood. As some of you may or may not realize, Ron's down in Pennsylvania, and we're up here in New England, and so we don't always get together. But if we get a chance to do that, we might do a live broadcast just for the fun of it. So hopefully we will see you in August. And before we go, also, I do want to let you know that in just a few days, I will be heading out to France, to a fairly remote region of France, where I will be pursuing the legend of the Beast of Gévaudan for my upcoming book, Hunting the Beast, Tracking the Werewolf of Gévaudan. And if anybody is interested in following that saga, you can pre-order the forthcoming Hunting the Beast at ghostboypress.com. That will be coming out this autumn, probably with luck. It'll actually be hitting the stands in September. So that's the plan for that. So hopefully a few folks will check in, and maybe when we come back at the end of the season, we'll do a program on the Beast.
Yeah, I'm excited for you. I think it's going to be a great work, and you and I will be under the same roof up at Ocean State Paracon, where your book would be available.
We will indeed in this coming September, and yes, God willing, or somebody willing, we will have that. We'll have those books on the table at that point, and we'll actually be able to hand books over to one another for the first time ever.
Absolutely, so I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, as always, want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, and hope that you enjoyed this show. It was a great, fun one for us, and we will see you in a couple of months. But keep with us here on Dead Air Full Spectrum for all the other wonderful content that is coming. We've got some great new shows that are going to be hitting the airwaves very soon, and always lots of great content. And we will see you in a couple of months at the tail end of summer. So, guys, have a wonderful season. Good night.
Bye.